All right, so here we are going to talk about the role of political factors and this empirical model that we're building. So, yeah, we've discussed structural factors, right? The base of that analytical pyramid. Now we're moving up a level to political factors, and then we're going to be applying them ultimately, right, to the explaining better understanding and explaining America's second Reconstruction or the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s here in America. All right, so what are these political factors that we should always be considering when we're trying to understand what's going on in American politics? Social movements. We'll see that that is a critical factor. Anytime you're talking about civil rights, right, you're going to need to take into account social movements. In our case, right, the Black Civil Rights Movement. In other cases, it might be the LGBTQ Civil Rights Movement, the Indigenous Peoples Movement, the Chicano Movement, the women's movements, and all of that, right? All right, so social movements. Political parties. Man, you can understand a lot about what goes on in our politics by understanding what's going on within our two political parties. Right, we know that, for example, today's Republican Party, it's hard to understand that party and therefore what goes on in our politics without knowing something about the impact of Donald Trump on the GOP. So, yeah, understanding political parties, critical to understanding what goes on in our politics. That's where an awful lot of the action is. And with democracy comes at least two political parties. Public opinion, right? We the people, what we the people think about things, and then how we act in response to those beliefs, right? That has a big impact on what happens in our politics. So public opinion. The media, right? No one doubts that. The media has a real impact on our politics. It's how we learn about politics, right? It's how we know what's going on in politics is through the media. Some media outlets might be more biased, some less biased, some more conservative, some more liberal, but regardless, right? It's going to be important to take that into account as a real factor in our politics. Elections. I'm stating the obvious, I hope, right? Elections have a big impact on our politics. Donald Trump wins in 2016, we go in a certain political direction, right, on all sorts of issues. Joe Biden wins in 2020, we go in a different direction on all those issues for the most part. So elections, huge. And then finally, interest groups. Right, the role of the NRA vis-a-vis gun rights, you want to take that into account, right? We need to think about the impact of really big organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, arguably the most powerful interest group in our political universe, the AARP. NAACP, and on and on. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. Social movements, another political factor that can help us better understand what goes on in American politics. In our particular case that we're looking at, it would certainly be the Black Civil Rights Movement, advancing a strategy most often of direct action, right? Taking their cause to the streets. Social movements often use non-traditional methods of participation. And so they did a lot of marches, right? A lot of sit-ins, those sorts of things. Non-traditional political tactics to express the interests of what are often outsider groups. In our case, again, the Black Civil Rights Movement, but you could quickly imagine, right, other case studies where you might look at other social movements, such as the women's movement, perhaps the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and queer civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, the democracy movement, right? Lots of other movements in American history often producing important changes, particularly in the arena of civil rights. We're thinking about the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. What role did our political parties play in this second Reconstruction? They played a critical role. Both parties, really. The ultimate vote for these two laws in terms of passing through Congress, actually a little more support from the Republican Party than from the Democratic Party. So in some ways, the difficult thing here was to get Democrats to support civil rights legislation, right? Historically, they were the party of the white South. They were the party that hated Abraham Lincoln, hated the Republican Party. We're very anti-civil rights. We're very pro, if you will, KKK, pro-white South. And so over time, there was a shift in the position of the Democratic Party. It began slowly, probably as early as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who began to move the Democratic Party more in the direction of being progressive on racial issues. Harry Truman next, right? He issued an executive order desegregating our military on the basis of race. And then ultimately we get John F. Kennedy, who again was a reluctant advocate of civil rights, but ultimately an advocate of civil rights. But difficult, right? Difficult for the Democratic Party to take this stance because historically they were deeply rooted in the white South. That was their core of support. The white South did not support a civil rights agenda, but for reasons that we've already seen, right, in terms of a demographic shift in America, African Americans moving out of the South into the North, and by moving into the North by the millions, becoming politically empowered, they're able to vote. They become key constituencies in important electoral states like Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Wisconsin, and so forth. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that Kennedy was so reluctant to advance a civil rights agenda. He worried that he would alienate the white South, the core of the Democratic Party. But ultimately, right, once he was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, himself a white Southerner, and he decides that this is how he is going to make his mark as a great president. He is going to advance aggressively, much more aggressively than Kennedy, a civil rights agenda. And he opined at the time, hey, look, because I'm the president, I'm spearheading this effort, I'm a Democrat. The Democrats will be seen as the party of civil rights for African Americans. That will cripple the Democratic Party in the white South for at least a generation to come. Turns out, of course, he underestimated the significance and the length of that shift. The white South ever since has moved steadily away from the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, right, circa the 1960s, mid-1960s, they were still, to a large extent, the party of Lincoln, the party of abolitionism, the party, if you will, of black people. They had moved away from that a bit over time, post-Civil War, had become increasingly, I think, the party of big business, less focused on civil rights issues, more focused on limiting government, promoting free enterprise, big business, that sort of thing. So the Republicans, circa the mid-1960s, were very willing to go along with a civil rights agenda led by a Democratic president, albeit had not pushed very hard under Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Republican president before John F. Kennedy. Eisenhower, I would argue, was lukewarm at best on civil rights issues. So some of these dynamics within our two major political parties, it's important to see how those were playing out at this time. That gives us a much better understanding of how we get the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. And that's often the case. To understand what's going on in American politics, you've got to understand what's going on within our two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. What role for public opinion? Well, I think as we've already referenced, the movement was able to use the media to influence public opinion, and as public opinion outside the South increasingly moved in the direction of the agenda of the Black Civil Rights Movement, this made it increasingly likely that Congress would respond to this shift in public opinion by ultimately passing major federal civil rights legislation. And that's exactly what we see playing out, right, in the case of America's second Reconstruction. As public opinion moves, so Congress moves, and ultimately as well, of course, so the president moves. So what role for the media in better understanding what goes on with America's second Reconstruction? We know that the Black Civil Rights Movement was able to attract media attention to some of their marches and demonstrations, and what often happened in these moments was that you got violence being committed by law enforcement against peaceful protesters. You got the police dogs, the batons, the tear gas, the beatings, the whole 9 yards. The media would cover these moments, They would then broadcast them on the evening news back in a day when on television you had three basic options. You had CBS, ABC, and NBC. They broadcast these images as they did on the nightly news. You reach a large chunk of the American population. Once these images were viewed by we the people, that began to move public opinion in favor of the Black Civil Rights Movement, in favor of ultimately passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. So to better understand this moment in time in American politics, one must take into account the role of the media. Matter a very great deal in terms of understanding what goes on in politics. That is certainly the case here. As we've already discussed, African Americans by the millions were leaving the South and moving to the North. And as they moved to the North, they became enfranchised, became voting citizens. And once they became voting citizens by the millions in states like Pennsylvania and New York and Ohio and Michigan, they were producing members of Congress that were sensitive to a civil rights agenda. So this helped set the stage for Congress passing major civil rights legislation. In addition, we the people elected John F. Kennedy in 1960, albeit he ran on a Cold War sort of a platform, more of a foreign policy platform. He did ultimately, albeit somewhat reluctantly, become an advocate for civil rights. Perhaps more importantly, right, once he's assassinated in the fall of '63, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, becomes president. And as we know, Lyndon B. Johnson becomes decisive in understanding how we get this civil rights legislation. Johnson becomes a vigorous, strong advocate of civil rights via his leadership on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and maybe to a somewhat lesser extent, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Theory of American politics then includes, as we discussed earlier, structural factors. It includes as well political factors, and that's what we've just gotten done reviewing, right? The role of such political factors as elections, political parties, interest groups, the media, social movements, and public opinion. All of these political factors go a very long way towards understanding what goes on in American politics.